What I recommend everyone to do is to schedule a nervous breakdown every day.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today I'm here with Arjuna Ardagh, who is a Radical Brilliance coach, a writer, and a public speaker, and he was the original founder of Awakening Coaching. He has trained more than 2,000 people to become awakening coaches over the last 25 years. Arjuna is also the author of 9 books, including the 2005 #1 national bestseller, The Translucent Revolution, featured in O Magazine. He's also written Better Than Sex, is the complete introduction to awakening coaching, and he co-authored Conscious Men with John Gray. Arjuna has been a speaker at conferences all over the world and has appeared on TV, radio, and in print media in 12 countries. He's spoken at Google and at the United Nations. He's a member of the Transformational Leadership Council as well, and he lives with his wife, Kamali Ardagh, in Nevada City, California. Thanks for joining us, Arjuna.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, Heather.
Oh, it's so good to talk with you. And you've been a teacher for so many years, and so you've been doing this for a long time, and you've written, I think, 15 books?
Yeah, the biography you read said 9, but I've been a busy boy since then, so now I'm up to 15, yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, so very experienced teacher, and you published your book on Radical Brilliance in 2017, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I'll take your word for it. I don't remember, but yeah, probably. If you say so, it's true.
It's your more recent work, and I'd love to focus on that with you today. I'm happy to talk about any of your other books as well. I'd love to, but I thought we could focus on Radical Brilliance. It's your most recent work. And first of all, what is Radical Brilliance? What is it, and what's the purpose of it?
Great. So Radical Brilliance is what I'm referring to is the invisible mechanism through which people have new ideas which have never been thought before, which are indisputably evolutionary for humanity. So one great example historically would be Copernicus, who recognized that we were running on an error. We were collectively assuming that all the planets were going around the Earth, which made everything very illogical and incoherent, and therefore purported a sort of crazy God with ADD. And Copernicus recognized the possibility that all of the planets were in fact going around the sun, which made everything coherent. And that correction of a misunderstanding really precipitated the Renaissance. Because once we had a coherent worldview, we could step out of superstition and fear of a punitive deity, and we could begin to co-create. And that precipitated art and architecture and the birth of modern science and all sorts of things. But more recently, Albert Einstein, he really was, you could say, the first instigator of quantum theory. And the general theory of relativity came to Einstein when he was relaxing in the bathtub. So he may have done preparation through his education and his work in laboratories, but the actual insight came when he was relaxing. So Radical Brilliance explores the mechanism through which people have original thoughts that have never been thought before.
That sounds really important and really big. And I'm wondering if you've just talked about 2 very important people in history, but do regular people have this as well?
Well, that's kind of my shtick, I suppose. I feel like everybody absolutely can have this because the way that I wrote this book, I did some reverse engineering. I've been very fascinated by brilliant people all my life. So by now I've done more than 500 interviews in different formats. Most of them actually are unpublished. I did 170 interviews for this book, Translucent Revolution. So I've been very interested to unpack when somebody is in an indisputably evolutionary relationship to humanity in the world, like Barbara Marx Hubbard would be a good example, or Lynn Twist. What's making them tick? And the way that this particular book happened with Radical Brilliance is I was actually laid up in bed after a car accident. So I kind of couldn't move for a while. And so this question was really haunting me. Like, what is it that precipitates brilliance? And I was thinking about this as if it was one thing, as if there was one precursor for brilliance. And I was thinking, well, what do all these people have in common? Is it spirituality and meditation? Is it that they're very creative? Is it that they have discipline about getting things done and making and keeping agreements, which is what Landmark Forum might suggest, for example? So what is it? And for a few weeks, I was really looking for the one magic key. And it was a little bit like doing a jigsaw puzzle, Heather. My father was a great, almost you could say like a professional jigsaw puzzler, if there is such a thing. He took his jigsaw puzzling very seriously. And so he would not look at the box. He would spread all the pieces out. He didn't know what the image was. And then he would assemble the pieces in groups. Okay, so here's a red bush. Oh, here's the roof of a house. So here's this, here's this. And slowly he would discover what the picture was of. So it was a little bit like that with Radical Brilliance, that I was noticing patterns here and patterns here and patterns here. And then the patterns actually started to form a whole. And so what emerged, rather than a straight line of a precursor for brilliance, it was actually a cycle. And you can see that cycle if you go to radicalbrilliance.com. You just enter your email and it will send you a diagram of the cycle. So brilliance, what I feel like I discovered is that brilliance is the emergent property out of 4 value sets coexisting in a human life. But these value sets have qualities that are counterintuitive to each other. So they don't obviously belong in the same life, but when they coexist, the emergent quality is brilliance, which means a life lived fully in contribution to a more evolved, a more organized way of being here on the planet, which is so urgently needed today.
I could imagine that everybody now is like, well, what are these 4 components? Could you go into them?
I definitely can. As you can imagine, I've done it a few times before. Yeah. So the best thing is to think of it like a clock, okay? So with a clock, you've got 12, 3, 6, and 9. So let's lay it out on a clock. At the top of the clock, 12 o'clock, we have what we could call moments of awakening. And very simply, what that means is moments where attention shifts deeper than the usual activity of thought and emotion. So the attention shifts deeper to realizing who you are deeper than you're thinking. And in a nutshell, we could say the words that people use when they have these kind of moments is spaciousness, infinity. There is no I. There is no kind of coagulation around a personal doer. There's just infinite space, unborn awareness. And this is really the center of many mystical traditions, including Advaita Vedanta in India and the Dzogchen teachings in Tibet. But it happens, you'll find this in every mystical tradition, these moments where the attention transcends the usual preoccupations of the personal. So that's 12 o'clock, these moments of awakening. Now, usually those moments, they exist. They find their home in an environment that is renunciatory. So very often spirituality has been bred in a monastic or a reclusive environment, which therefore puts the dampers a little bit on creative expression. There is one tradition that has not done that, which is called Kashmiri Shaivism. As you might imagine, it originated in Kashmir, and it centers around a text called the Vigyan Bhairav Tantra, which is a discourse between Shiva and his consort Parvati. So that's one of the few texts that celebrates the kind of effervescent nature of awakening. So that probably sounds a little obscure, but what I mean by that is if you rest in this spaciousness, there is an effervescence to the spaciousness. It has a kind of bubbling quality. If the attention can rest with it without rushing ahead, which becomes desire and ambition, but also without holding back, which becomes very often what's taught as meditation. If you can actually allow that effervescence to happen, it starts the journey from 12 to 3 on the clock, which is, in Kashmiri Shaivism, they call this Spanda, this kind of naturally vibrating aliveness. And if you allow it to build in intensity, it becomes creative flow. It becomes writing that is just coming through you. It becomes music that is just flowing through you. It becomes creating an app or a company or whatever. But the sense is it's coming through you, not from you. And that's the movement from 12 to 3, that you are taken over by a creative flow that has a source beyond yourself. Now, we can do another take on this in a minute, if you like, and we can talk about the brain chemistry involved. So once we get to 3 o'clock, we're in a state of full-on creative flow. And now there's a shift, because one of the types of creative impulse is called intention. So intention arises as a type of creative flow, but intention is creativity with a future thought attached to it. So you've been jamming as musicians. Now the thought comes, let's make an album. Now you have a future event which is postulated. Or it might be, let's write a book, or let's make a company. But it's an intention with future attached to it. So in that intention, we start the next movement, which is the movement from intention to accomplishment. And this involves a completely different kind of biochemistry and brain chemistry. I won't go into all of that right now, but by the time we get close to 6, because you're operating within the limits of time and space, now the element is introduced of stress, which is characterized by norepinephrine in the brain. So when you're under stress, the parasympathetic nervous system activity shuts down and the sympathetic nervous system is accentuated. So it means if you're tired, if you have intuition in your body, if you have emotion, all of that gets shut down to get the job done. So that's what happens at 6 o'clock. So now we're halfway around the cycle. And 6 is completely the opposite of 12. You see, 12, there's nobody here, there's infinity, there's no time, utter spaciousness. 6 o'clock is you are fully constrained within time and space. You're making agreements and you're obliged to keep to them. All right. So now we move just beyond 6 o'clock and we move into what we could call parasympathetic flooding. So what quite often happens is when people have accomplished something big in the world, you've launched the company, the book is published, the movie is out, very often creative people experience depression. It's like a postpartum depression of creativity, basically, because you get this parasympathetic flooding. All the impulses of emotion and body sensation and stress that you were pushing down flood to the surface. And it's accompanied by a subjective experience of regret, remorse, even shame, and a feeling of failure. Because at 6 o'clock you were obliged to make choices, this or that, your success was at the cost of some other kind of failure. So now it begins a new movement from 6 to 9, and it's the movement of learning. You start feeling like, oh, I messed up, I stressed myself out, I ignored my family, whatever it is. But now as you move, this is where learning happens. You move through introspection and learning. And the movement now is to 9 o'clock, where you are fully in a state of self-forgiveness, forgiving other people, self-acceptance. You feel you have earned the right to rest. And this is actually characterized by GABA in the brain. So now at 9 o'clock, you feel I've done enough. I'm just a little person doing my best. I'm not like, I can't solve all the problems in the world, but you feel full self-acceptance and forgiveness. And that happens through learning. So now the next movement from 9 to 12 is characterized first by an intuition of something bigger than me, right? So it's an intuition. Wow. So if it's not my thoughts and my understanding which is making all this happen because you feel very humble, then what is really making all this work? And either you take that inquiry inwards and it becomes a kind of self-inquiry through meditation and a discovery of your deeper potential, or it faces outwards and it becomes devotion to a kind of divinity, which is making the world beautiful in the way that it is. So either way, you go from 9 to 12, which is the movement from humility back into awakening. So that's the cycle. You go from awakening to creative flow, to accomplishment, to humility, and back to awakening.
Wow. So let me just summarize what I heard in a very brief, a very brief way.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, so there are 4 phases in the cycle. And it's interesting because as you were going through, I was going, okay, I recall when I was in that part and I recall when I was in that part. Yeah. So it was really, for me, very helpful. It's the second time I've been exposed to it as well. So it sunk in a little bit deeper this time, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And so the moments of awakening, do you think that happens for people when they've been out of their routine? I mean, you talked about it in the sense of people frequently experiencing these moments of awakening when they're in sort of a spiritual environment, let's say like at the ashram or, meditation center or something like that. But that it's also, and you experienced it, in bed with an injury. But I guess, do you feel like it's necessary for people to be out of the routine of their life in order to have these moments of awakening?
Well, you certainly need to be out of your mind, right? But being out of your mind could be part of the routine of your life. That would be a very intelligent thing, actually, to schedule into your routine time to be out of mind and out of time. Those awakening moments, it could happen through, as you said, obviously spiritual things like meditation or going to an ashram. It could happen through the use of psychedelics. In fact, there's a lot of evidence before LSD was made illegal. Jim Fadiman and his team, they did a lot of experimenting at Columbia on what happens if you give LSD to scientists, that they become way more creative. So it could happen through psychedelics. It can happen through great sex. If you enter into sex with the intention to linger in a more expansive state of consciousness, that also is a very effective way. It can happen through extreme sports. So Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheal, who wrote the book Stealing Fire and also The Return of Superman, most of what they know about flow states comes from extreme sports. So that's another portal in. There are many portals into transcending your mind, but the important thing is to have something or a group of things that really works.
Yeah, I like the way that you summarize that, because it seems like the way that you said it earlier, you said there's this sense of there being no I, and that we sort of are resting in the spaciousness, and that the way that you said it was my favorite, was that you have a shift into a state that is deeper than who you are. And when I heard that, I mean, for me, because I feel like my whole life I'm just trying to get out of my thoughts.
Yeah.
I feel like that's why many of us are meditating and doing all these things. So thank you for clarifying that.
I think it might be helpful for, I don't know exactly who your listeners are, but it might be helpful to unpack something that you just said, because I think we could get some juice from it. Is that okay?
Please, yes.
Because, the way that all of us, the way that we get tripped up in all of this is because we create concepts and then we get caught within our concepts, right? I'm not wanting to pick on you like a bully here. I'm talking about the way that this happens for absolutely all of us. Is as soon as we try and speak about any of this, we use language to speak about it. And because of the very nature of language as being inaccurate to describe this, we create concepts, and that the concepts then become the very prison we're trying to escape from. So I think what you just said was, I didn't actually write it down because I didn't grab my pen quick enough, but I think you said something along the lines of, I spend quite a bit of my life trying to get out of my mind. More or less, you said something like that, right?
Yes, that's pretty much what I said.
Pretty much. So I think if we unpack it, and again, please forgive me because I don't want to be like unfairly, picking on you, because it's something any of us could have said. It's a completely normal statement because that's how we think. I could say the same thing. But then we have to ask, I spend quite a bit of my time trying to get out of my mind. So we're trying to get an I out of my mind, So it's actually quite useful to take a minute to contemplate what is the I and what is the my mind that there's an attempt to get the I out of. So I don't want to spend too much time because we want to cover other things, but briefly, in that sentence, getting the I out of my mind, what is the I that we're trying to extract from my mind?
Do you want me to answer that?
Well, just, whatever comes.
I mean, for me, it feels like it's conditioning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So very simply, we'll do this in shorthand because it takes a little time to unpack it fully. But basically, if we were to drill down together and really, really try and kind of discover and focus on and thoroughly accurately describe this I, what do you think we would find?
Just beliefs, things that we've learned from other people, the past.
Exactly. So what it means is it doesn't exist except in belief. It means it only exists in thought. It doesn't actually exist outside of thinking about it. So there are other things like that in life. There are plenty of things that we get wrapped up in that only exist in our thought. And if you don't think about them, they're not there. So there are things in our life that are absolutely real. Like I'm holding a pen in my hand and it's a real pen. But supposing that it's nighttime and the wind is causing the branch of a tree to kind of knock against the window, as once happened for me, I might get really scared about the intruder who's, trying to get into the house. But there is no intruder. It only exists in my mind, you see. So very often we preoccupy ourselves with things that only exist in thinking. And we could give lots more examples. So the I then is not really real. But you also said that the I only exists because of beliefs and thinking, which is absolutely true. But you see, the mind is just the word collectively for all those beliefs. So trying to get the I out of my mind is impossible because the I is made of the beliefs. The mind is made of the beliefs. They're synonymous. The I is how the mind is created, So here's the interesting thing. If we see that trying to get the I out of the mind or trying to pacify the mind or any of that, which we usually get caught up in, if we see all of that as completely pointless because there really is no I and there is no mind, it's all made up, then what remains? If we realize that the I is simply the product of thinking and the mind is simply the product of thinking, and we don't have to stop the thinking because the activity of stopping the thinking becomes a kind of mental activity. But if we just leave all that alone and just let it do its thing and become curious about who is here or who or what is really experiencing this moment, when we just let all that go, what do we discover?
The spaciousness.
Exactly.
Okay. So the way that you talked about the effervescence, the bubbling of consciousness, the spanda, that this vibrating, can you differentiate that from thought, or is that still thought?
That is the seed of an impulse that is arising spontaneously out of infinity. But it's not a thought that is being generated by other thoughts in, quotes, the mind. You see, so in the book, Radical Brilliance, the second chapter or the third chapter is called Two Types of Thought. And it makes this distinction between thought, which is part of the incessant activity of mind, just constantly rearranging these thoughts. They're all regurgitated thoughts. And so if you lay awake at night and your mind just can't stop spinning, those are not original thoughts. Those are thoughts that are just bouncing around from things that have been heard. But when the attention drops into spaciousness, then there is the possibility for original thought to occur, which is a spontaneous impulse arising out of nothing. And actually, if you look into it, you have to kind of dig a little bit, but Einstein refers to this, Steve Jobs refers to this, Barbara Marx Hubbard talked about it, Leonard Cohen talked about it, and I actually reproduce a conversation I had with Leonard Cohen in the book. So really, all truly great original impulses that really change the course of humanity, everything that's truly great and original arises spontaneously out of emptiness. It doesn't come from the busyness of a mind out of control.
And this is why we need retreat centers. So, okay, you talked about creating the channel and that once you go from these moments of awakening, the pathway then goes toward creative flow and creativity. And that, I guess I want to talk about this a little bit because I do have a lot of listeners who are people who are interested in creativity in general. They're interested in fertility because I wrote a fertility book. And I think that there's a fascinating connection there with, not just how we create works of art, companies, but also with people as well. I mean, you also mentioned that sort of that state, that awakening state, and going, obviously with sex as well. Is there anything you'd like to comment on that connection?
Yeah, I think, in many ways, that's a beautiful, beautiful analogy. In many ways, what happens in a woman's body from the moment of the egg being released and meeting the sperm, what happens very much can be mapped into this cycle. So the process of the growth of the embryo inside a woman's body through to the birth and everything, it can all be seen in this cycle. That really, when the egg is released and meets the sperm, prior to that, there was nothing. There was no child, But when the egg and the sperm meet, which is a biological event, if the egg and the sperm had continued to exist without meeting, it would not have led to new life, right? I mean, eggs are released every month in a woman's cycle, but they don't become new life. Sperm is released every time a man ejaculates, but it doesn't become new life. When the egg and the sperm meet, which is a biological event, it actually creates an emergent property, which is new life, which is a new life that will become autonomous. And you could say that the growth of the embryo is mapped all the way from 12 to 6 until the moment of birth. And I think I mentioned to you that 6 o'clock, right after 6, when there is this accomplishment, there's this event, it's very often followed by depression. So creative people will go through a kind of a time when there's parasympathetic flooding. And the phenomenon of postpartum depression is, very well documented, that women, they've just had this baby and nothing could be better. Everything's beautiful. And the woman feels depressed because there was the necessity of parasympathetic repression in order to go through this incredible event of giving birth to a new human being. So I think it's very important. I mean, I should not be saying anything because I'm a man, and the worst thing in the world is mansplaining, men talking about women's cycles. So very humbly, as a mere man, speaking about the feminine body where I've got no right to at all, we could postulate that after birth, it's very important to be able to allow this parasympathetic activity to occur. And I'm very much a believer and advocate, what happens in Norway, for example, and Germany too. Women are paid by the government to stay home for, I think it's 2 years. In Norway, the government will pay you. They say, we will give you fixed salary, your full salary of what you were doing when you were working as a job. We want you to stay home because we want you to fully nurture this new little Norwegian that has arrived in our very small population. Now, of course, not every country has the accumulated resources to do that, but it is wonderful, for a woman after giving birth to be able to enjoy this period of parasympathetic activity and to be able to come into that. Because the 9 o'clock that I mentioned is humility. It's also a state of love. It's a state of tremendous love. So I don't know much about this. It's something we could explore together because I'm not a woman and I haven't studied all these things, but it would be an interesting topic to explore creatively together, Heather, how we could use this map maybe to explain the different phases of pregnancy and what happens after birth.
If you want to create a more receptive body, free from toxins, inflammation, and metabolic issues, would it be crazy for you to explore booking an Ayurvedic consultation with me? There's probably never been a more perfect time to do it. Every day you wait matters when it comes to your health. So if you're ready to get your body back in balance, I'll give you a 30-day plan to get you started. Go to heathergrish.com to book a consultation. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Yeah, I really like it. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of Samkhya, but like in a more digestible way. And the reason that I always love Samkhya philosophy, which I don't know if the listeners know what that is, but it's one of the philosophical schools of India. And it's sort of, it always seemed to me like a creation process. And that, I don't know if you knew that I was head of product development for a health insurance company before I became an Ayurvedic practitioner. So I've always been very fascinated by creative processes, not just the human body ones, but I'm often drawing the connections between the creative processes that we do in our work, in our passions, and, whatever we sort of exhibit that through, and the way that we create in our body. So I'm happy that we went through that. And yeah, in the future, we could definitely, but for people who are creating, whether it's music or art or, a book. I mean, I've written a book and I have a lot of other friends that are authors, and I've definitely have gotten that feedback from people that 9 months or so after the book is 6 to 9 months after the book is launched, that they get depressed actually after it happens. Now, my book has been out just about 9 months, I think.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that hasn't happened to me yet because I feel like I'm still in this, maybe I've already gone into like a new cycle.
Yeah.
I don't know, because I could see how like somebody who is a serial startup founder or anybody who's creating things repetitively in their life could really, really, really get this process. It seems very sensible to me, like a very good representation of what has happened to me in my own creative processes. So from the 3 to 6 o'clock, when you go and you're in the world, and like you said, that you're fully constrained, you're making agreements and you're obliged to do them with the parasympathetic flooding and that sort of the processes that are in motion to enable the success, to enable the achievement, the creation, the manifestation of this thing.
I think what I have noticed is the period of parasympathetic flooding be dramatically altered. So what I recommend everyone to do is to schedule a nervous breakdown every day, right? Now, normally what happens is if you look at the chart, if you have it, if anybody downloaded it already, you can get it when you go to radicalbrilliance.com and you put in your email, it will give you the chart. But mostly we stay way too long in 3 to 6. We can stay, months just cycling in 3 to 6 and suppressing parasympathetic activity. And if you do that long enough, you have a breakdown where you just can't function anymore. Your life falls apart. And very often that is, accompanied by some form of addiction because you have to use addictive substances to fuel you in this constant cycling of push. So when the parasympathetic flooding happens, it's really intense and extreme, and it can produce an experience of burnout, which can take months to get over that. And sometimes people never get over it. They get some sort of immune disease, like Epstein-Barr or mono or chronic fatigue, and they never get better. So I encourage everybody to have a nervous breakdown every day around when the sun goes down, to really stop and contemplate your mistakes of the day. Take 5 or 10 minutes to contemplate things you did where maybe in the rush of pushing forward and trying to meet deadlines, you might have been abrupt with somebody, or you might have been ignoring your own body or ignoring your own family. And to really feel it, I think the important thing is to really let yourself feel it just for a few minutes. Particularly it happens around the sternum, the breastbone or on the front of the body, just to feel that sinking feeling of shame. And just to let yourself feel shame for a few minutes, not forever. And if you feel it, then you can naturally move into self-forgiveness and learning. You can make a commitment to not repeat that mistake again. And it then moves you into the next part of the day, the evening, where you can prepare to wind down into the phases of dreamless sleep you will have in the night, where your brain goes into infinity again. So I think it's a great thing to actively structure parasympathetic activity. And also that's why, most religious traditions have advocated some kind of Sabbath. In Judaism, it's a Saturday. In Christianity, it's a Sunday, a day when you do nothing. I think it's a great idea today, these days, to switch off Clubhouse and switch off all electronics and just have a day where you can just stare at trees or take walks, where you don't try to accomplish anything, because that's a day set aside for your system to reset.
It's pretty important that people do that. And being caught in many cycles like this in my 30s, I remember when I first did Panchakarma. Have you ever done Panchakarma?
I have. I did a 3-week Panchakarma in Kerala. Yeah.
Okay. So the first time I did it, I was at home and kind of doing a home Panchakarma. And I remember my practitioner saying, when you're doing this, don't look at your computer. Don't try not to read anything. Try not to have stuff that you're busying yourself with. And that thought alone was probably the worst torture. I remember just sitting there looking out a window and just staring. And I challenged myself. I said, okay, Heather, you are not going to look at a screen or read a book or anything all day. And I just sat on the floor. I didn't even have a couch at the time. I was doing so much yoga. I just wanted all the space in my living room. So I just sat on a pile of yoga bolsters in the middle of my living room and stared out the window like a zombie and watched the birds. It was one of the most difficult things I've ever done, was to spend a whole day not looking at a TV, not looking at a book, not looking at a phone, not calling anybody, just existing and staring.
Yeah, it is hard. Actually, it's funny. It's hard and it's not hard. It's because it's not actually hard to do nothing. I mean, if you can do something, it's even easier to do nothing. It's hard because of what you have to feel. You are obliged then to feel all the things that get pushed down when we're trying to accomplish something. And you can go down the rabbit hole. When those feelings are arising, you can get caught in some pretty crazy thoughts, So it's very important, I think, when you're having a decompression time, to promise yourself not to take thoughts seriously, because part of the subjective experience of parasympathetic flooding is that you're going to feel shame, regret, remorse, failure. And those are toxic feelings if they take over your whole life. But if you let them come briefly, they are the fastest path to learning, because if you feel shame in your body, you're going to have a visceral motivation to learn the lesson you need to learn and to not make the same mistake again.
I love that. Schedule a nervous breakdown every day. I'm going to do that, Arjuna. It's interesting because I think, going back to Panchakarma, for me, it was more, I don't think I had a lot of the spiraling thoughts because I was so focused on what my body was going through, because it was on the day of where you're, having to run to the bathroom every 5 minutes, the Panchakarma. So I actually did not get super caught up in my mind because there was so much going on in my body that I was forced to feel as well. But, I think that part of the torture, and it's hard when you're being distracted by something you're doing to your body, but part of the torture, I think, when we meditate or when we kind of cut ourselves off and we practice that pratyahara or interoception, is that recognizing our grasping patterns. And we start to, I talk about it as like a little hand. I feel like I have this little hand in my brain that wants to reach out to everything. That mechanism of grasping. So I'm in the spaciousness.
Yeah.
And perhaps maybe in your cycle, you're sort of talking about it more as moving into the creative flow. But for me, it feels like a grasping, like I have a hand. And it reminds me I have a friend who's a cell biologist who told me that she realized that everything wants to connect because she saw two cells in a petri dish and one growing tentacles out to touch the other. Sort of this desire to sort of connect. That's what it comes up with for me a lot when I meditate. And I was kind of curious about where that fell in your flow here.
When these impulses, so the impulses, by the way, the only tradition I'm aware of that really properly, thoroughly articulates this movement of impulse out of stillness is Kashmiri Shaivism. They talk about it there as Spanda. So the art is to neither repress the impulses nor to run with them faster than they're moving. So there are a whole bunch of hypermasculine traditions, the most obvious one being Zen Buddhism. Zen Buddhism is very clearly a tradition that was created by men for men. It's very suited to the male body, which runs on testosterone. And when you sit in this sort of very austere way with your spine completely straight, it's the fastest way to replenish testosterone. And Zen very much emphasizes emptiness, formlessness. So, for example, in Zen, but equally in the Hinayana schools in Buddhism, like Vipassana, there's strong encouragement to not follow thought. So that means that there is an encouragement to keep coming back to the emptiness. So these impulses of creativity, Spanda, they won't have a chance to blossom if there is a strong preference for emptiness. Equally, there's also another kind of school of thought, which is more like the law of attraction, manifesting, think and grow, which is kind of just follow every impulse, like go, 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 which is a little bit rushing ahead or pushing. And that will also, that's rather like when a flower is opening, that you're so impatient to see the beauty of the flower that you rip the bud apart with your fingers. So that's going to kill it. So what's necessary somehow is, in being present with these impulses, is to allow them to unfold naturally on their own. So when I work with my clients, the people that I work with, by the way, I used to have a coaching school. So I think you read in my biography that I trained 2,000 coaches. I don't train people anymore. I just work with individuals who want to make an extraordinary impact in the world. I think I just got a little bit burned out on, all of the business of having an organization. So I just work with individuals now as a brilliance coach. And so with my clients, I teach them a way of being in meditation. And it has 3 components, right? So the first component is scanning the body, looking through the body, noticing the body, and looking for places of contraction. So that, you could say, is the movement from 9 to 12. You're scanning the body. You're noticing almost like tiny pockets of trauma that need to be released through being experienced. The middle part of the meditation is paying attention to the emptiness. And that the main question is to then ask is, who is experiencing this moment, or what is experiencing this moment, and to become curious, experientially, not conceptually, to become curious, to discover the nature of consciousness itself. And the third part is the Spanda, and that is to actually, again, come back to the body and to notice pockets of pleasure in the body. Now, the best way to understand this is to remember what it feels like when you're horny. At the very beginning of feeling horny, sometimes you can get horny just through a glance or just through seeing a body part or something, and you just start. So long before you're fully aroused, there's just this little tickle of aroused energy. We're familiar with that in the genitals, but you can have it anywhere in your body, just this little tickle of like arousal. And that's the beginning of Spanda, this tiny impulse of arousal. If you breathe into it and encourage it and go, there it is, and you just fan the flames with your breath, it will become stronger. And then I encourage people, when they finish this meditation practice, now they're feeling pretty aroused, creatively aroused through their whole body, then to take a voice recorder or a journal with a pen and to actually commit some of that aroused creative energy, recorder or to paper.
That really sort of like aliveness.
Yes. I think the word arousal is really good. Barbara Marx Hubbard did a really good job of this, of recognizing that the creative process, some of the best language to use to accurately describe the creative process is sexual language, because it's a sexual process, but it's just sex, not in the genitals. It's sexual energy transmuted into other parts of the body. And coincidentally, the Vigyan Bhairav Tantra that I described to you, it describes 112 methods of working in this way. 6 of them are overtly sexual. 6 of them. So you can use the aroused sexual energy and you can transmute it into other parts of the body. When you take that arousal from the genitals, move it up into the heart, it becomes creative love. If you move it up into throat, it becomes creative expression. So the energy that we're used to, almost everybody knows about arousal because of their sexual experience. They don't necessarily know about arousal from other centers in the body. And if you learn how to move the arousal into other parts of the body, you'll learn a lot about genuine creativity that is not imitative, but that is innovative.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for sharing that. And one more question, and then I want you to tell everybody how to get in contact with you.
Sure.
How would you define the wisdom of the body? What does that mean to you?
Well, the body has a lot of kinds of wisdom, the body is an extraordinary machine, or whatever you call it. It's an extraordinary organism. It's so much more that the body is capable of than we can explain through science. So one thing the body does is it does communicate directly its needs. It tells you when it needs rest, tells you when it needs to drink, tells you when it needs to eat, it tells you when it wants to have sex, it tells you when it wants to exercise, it tells you when it needs to stretch its muscles. And you can see how dogs and cats are much better at listening to those impulses. We tend to frequently ignore them as human beings. Equally, the body also can be used as an instrument of intuition. So the body, you can also, once you've managed to clear the pent-up emotion which gets held in the body, once you're in a fairly kind of neutral place, you can use the body for knowing. And the sternum is the best antenna for that. You can use the body to inform you about what's useful and what's not. Equally, the body is how we experience emotion. There's no emotion except through the body. So the body is our way of having this extraordinary thing called emotion, which can't really be explained, you know. I mean, emotion is very much what generates art. And we have no scientific explanation so far that adequately explains the richness of emotional and emotional expression. I mean, we can try, but no one has really managed to explain emotion through biology or through brain chemistry. So the body, I mean, that's a lot already, you know, that the body is doing. Also, through the body, we can access ancestral memory. We can access intuition. I mean, it's just an extraordinary, complex sort of, I don't know, what would the analogy be? It's like a sort of, it's like a transducer that is able to tune into so much information that it could not possibly be explained by the brain cells or the cells in the body. It makes a lot more sense to think of the body as a transducer than as a generator. In other words, as a transducer, it is picking up on a much bigger body of experience that we don't know where it lives. It's just, it's somehow, yeah, it's like, it's wave-like. It's kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Rather in the same way that a radio does not contain the orchestra. You can use a radio to play music, but the trumpets and the piano and the violin are not inside the radio. The radio is a transducer that is picking up radio waves. And I think in another 100 or 200 years, we will understand that the spine is something like an antenna. And, you know, we don't have a tail. Everybody has the tiniest remnant of a tail, which is just this little kind of dot at the base of your spine. But other animals have a tail. But they haven't learned to put their spine upright. So if you have a dog or a cat, if you go for a walk with your dog, you'll see the dog is constantly moving the tail around. And the tail is frequently, you know, sticking upwards. When a dog is kind of on and really present and there, the tail goes up. And the tail, it really looks like it, the way we have an antenna to pick up radio signals. When a dog is dejected and disconnected, the tail droops. And equally cats, you know, you can see this in many animals, that the tail appears to have some function. It has no obvious biological function except as the possibility that it's an antenna. Now, animals that have an upright spine, then the tail is no longer needed. Now, I don't know anything about this. This is just purely amateur mumbling and fumbling in the dark. But the wisdom of the body, I think, is most easily understood if we think of the body as a transducer more than as a producer of experience.
I think that's certainly helpful to think of it that way, especially if we're trying to tap into our creativity.
Yeah, exactly, Heather, because then we can recognize that true creativity comes through us, not from us.
So beautiful, Arjuna. I have a feeling people are going to want to get to know you. How can they contact you?
Best thing is to go to radicalbrilliance.com. I'm just redoing my personal website. To go to radicalbrilliance.com, just type in your name and email. And if you go to the contact form, you can fill out that form and that will reach also. But I think, you know, if you go to radicalbrilliance.com and type in your email, it will give you 5 days of introduction to all this. And it should answer a lot of questions. I would say, you know, the next step would be maybe to read the book. And if you feel then the main thing that I do right now is I work with individuals who really feel called to make a global impact. And that's a bigger commitment. You know, I usually work with people for a year. So I would say, go to the website and download the stuff and check it out and maybe look at the book. And if it really speaks to you, then, you know, then by all means get in touch and we can set up a time to speak one-on-one.
Thank you so much for being here today, Arjuna. I'm so grateful for your time, and I love what you shared today, and I feel like I learned so much. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure entirely, Heather. Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.